when they were 22 years old, Silas and Jonas were identical twins. Their presence began to disturb the peace of the small villages hidden in the misty peaks of the Appalachian Mountains. The two brothers found the perfect place for their shady activities in that far-off area where the roads were just muddy paths and the police took days to get there. The thick oak and pine forests made natural paths of darkness, even during the day. This strange geography was something they knew better than anyone else. In 1897, the people in the area lived simply. There were farms all over the valleys and small villages that were hard to find on state maps. People knew each other by name, trusted each other, and didn't lock their doors very often. The brothers, who had grown up on those same lands and knew every shortcut, cave, and stream that snaked through the hillsides, would use this shared innocence in a planned way. Silas was only a few centimeters taller, but both of them had clear eyes that seemed to see through anyone they talked to. They wore plain clothes for farm work, wide-brimmed hats, and boots that were always covered in the red clay that is typical of that area. People wouldn't think that behind those normal-looking faces were minds that were very sharp. The brothers had a strange relationship with each other. Jonas was the first to reach out, and he was always friendly and helpful to travelers who crossed the mountains. Silas stayed in the shadows, watching, planning, and waiting for the right time. They didn't do it on a whim. Every move was planned, every word was carefully chosen, and every gesture was meant to put people at ease. It all worked perfectly. At that time, the Appalachian Mountains were a natural barrier between the East, which was growing, and the West, which was growing. People who traveled often had to go over those winding paths on horseback or in uncomfortable wagons that rattled over rocks and roots that were sticking out. Many people wanted to find the quickest way to get there, the best routes, and a safe place to sleep. Silas and Jonas came into the picture right there. They had a secret cabin in a clearing that only people who knew the right natural landmarks could get to. There was a skull-shaped rock here, a forked tree there, and a stream that went the other way from what was expected. At first glance, the property looked empty, but it was very well organized inside. There were ropes hanging from certain hooks, tools arranged in a very neat way, and a cellar that few people ever got to see. Their method was simple but elegant in a creepy way. Jonas offered food and a place to sleep. He talked about how hard it was to cross and how bears and thieves were said to be dangerous in other places. He made people feel safe by making them think they had found kind people in a dangerous world. Silas, on the other hand, got ready for what would happen next. He was always at the back of the property, out of sight, and waiting for the signal they had agreed on. We can only guess what the people who accepted that hospitality were thinking. They were thankful for getting help, relieved that they didn't have to sleep outside, and falsely sure that they had been lucky. But the Appalachian Mountains hold secrets from long ago, and strange things would happen in that lonely cabin that we can't explain. It was rare for newspapers from the area to get to those far-off valleys, and when they did, they brought news from weeks ago. It was hard for communities to talk to each other because they had to rely on messengers or traveling traders. Because the information was so spread out, it was easy for strange things to go unnoticed for a long time. People often went missing in the mountains because of accidents, wild animals, or just getting lost on the confusing trails. No one thought that some of these quiet times were caused by people. Silas and Jonas were very patient. They could go weeks without seeing anyone, living off hunting and small-scale farming and looking like regular farmers. But when someone came along at the right time and on the right path, their true instincts came to life, and the mountain saw things that should never have happened. The brothers' daily lives were very strict, almost like the military. They would get up before dawn when the fog still covered the valleys like a thick white blanket. Silas looked after the animals they kept on the property, which included a dairy cow, 2 pigs, and some chickens. These animals helped the place look normal. Jonas took care of the cabin by fixing loose boards, strengthening structures, and making sure everything looked nice for any visitors who might come. The mountains around were a natural maze of rocks and deep gorges. Waterfalls fell from great heights, making a constant sound of running water that drowned out other sounds. The brothers were familiar with every sound, every echo, and every strange sound in that area. They knew exactly where their voices went and where they were kept. They used this information for a specific purpose. A pioneer built the cabin many years ago, and their name has been lost to time. It had thick walls made of interlocking logs, a wooden roof covered in moss that grew naturally, and small windows that let in very little light even during the day. There were 3 main rooms inside: a common room with a fireplace, a shared bedroom, and a simple kitchen. But there was also that basement, which could be reached through a hidden trapdoor under an old carpet. Jonas was very good with words. He could make anyone feel at ease by telling long stories about the area and making up stories about mountain spirits that were said to protect honest travelers. His voice was deep and soothing, the kind that made you feel safe right away. He knew when to smile, when to frown with real concern, and when to put his hand on someone's shoulder as a sign of friendship. He was a great actor on a stage made of dirt and old wood. Silas was different. He was more thoughtful and quiet, and he always seemed to be thinking about something. He didn't start conversations very often, but when he did, he was very clear and careful with his words. He handled the practical parts of his brother's activities, like organizing tools, planning different ways to get through the mountains, and memorizing the patrol's movement patterns that sometimes came through the area. He was the planner, and Jonas was the negotiator. In 1898, technology hadn't made it to those far-off parts of West Virginia yet. There were no telegraphs or paved roads. There was only what nature gave and what people could build with little money. Because there was no modernity, there was a time bubble where some things could happen without anyone seeing them except for the old trees and the birds that flew over the peaks. The brothers made up secret codes that only they understood. For example, a touch on the hat, a certain way of lighting the pipe, or the way Jonas set the table. There was meaning in everything. Everything was silent communication that no one else could understand. This secret language made their actions even more coordinated, turning them into one being with one goal. The trees around the cabin were so thick that they blocked out all sounds except for birds singing and the occasional coyote howl in the distance. A green wall made up of huge oak trees with trunks as wide as small houses blocked the view just a few meters away. The ground was a soft carpet of decaying leaves that muffled footsteps, and moss hung from the branches like green curtains. It was a place that seemed to be made to keep secrets. We, who live in modern times, can't even begin to understand how completely cut off those mountain areas were. It was possible to go days without seeing anyone else besides the people you were traveling with. The loneliness was so deep that it became unbearable, and meeting another person became a big deal. The brothers knew exactly how to take advantage of the relief people felt when they met them. The relationship between Silas and Jonas was disturbingly interdependent. They made up for each other's weaknesses and made each other's strengths stronger by working together. They made something bigger and more dangerous than the sum of their parts. There was an unspoken understanding between them that didn't need words, a deep understanding that only twins seemed to be able to develop. But in this case, that connection was used for bad things. The seasons changed the mountains in very big ways. The cabin was completely cut off from the outside world for weeks in the winter when the snow was more than a meter thick. In the spring, the thaw made the trails impossible because of the raging torrents that flowed down the slopes. In the summer, the heat and humidity brought a lot of bugs and storms that came out of nowhere. In the fall, the leaves turned the landscape red and gold before falling off and showing the trees' skeletons. Every season had its own problems and chances. The brothers ruled over a lot of rough land, covering several square kilometers. The area was as big as it was confusing. There were at least 3 main roads that crossed that area. Merchants and travelers had to use these roads to get over the Appalachian Mountains to the Western Territories. Jonas had made a mental map of each of these paths. He knew where people naturally stopped to rest, where they got water, and where they were so tired from the journey that they couldn't refuse any offer of help. They took care of more than just the main cabin. There were small, secondary buildings all over the forest. These were basic shelters that served specific purposes. One was a type of smokehouse where meat was cooked and stored. Another was used to store tools and supplies. There was also a third building, smaller and less visible than the others. It was in a natural dip in the ground where the plants grew especially thick. There was only one door in this building, and it didn't have any windows. When it wasn't being used, the inside was always locked. Silas spent hours in that lonely building, sorting through things he had gathered over time. There were old coins from different parts of the world, pocket watches with engravings on the lids, simple wedding rings, and medallions with small hand-painted portraits inside. Each thing had a silent story behind it, like a journey that was cut short or a destination that was never reached. He put them on makeshift shelves and made up stories about their past owners, keeping track of where he thought they came from in his head. It was a creepy museum of other people's memories that had been turned into trophies. Jonas, on the other hand, kept notebooks where he wrote down details about the people he met, such as how they looked, their regional accents, where they said they were going, and what they were carrying. For someone who lived in such a rough area, his handwriting was surprisingly nice. Each letter was made with almost artistic care. These records didn't seem to have any useful purpose, but for him, they were a way to control things by putting the chaos of human interactions into understandable groups. It was like he was writing his own messed-up travel journal. In 1899, the Appalachian Mountains were a different world with their own set of rules. In those far-off places, official law only existed on paper, and county sheriffs had too much land to patrol effectively. It could take a police officer days to get to a certain place, and by the time they got there, it was usually too late to help. This hole in the established order made it possible for some people to act with almost complete freedom. The brothers had a natural understanding of how people think and feel. They knew that tired people made bad choices, that people who traveled alone were more at risk than people who traveled in groups, and that the promise of basic comfort could make people less cautious. Jonas had a disturbing ability to find emotional weaknesses and say exactly what someone needed to hear at the right time. It was manipulation turned into a dark art. It was part of their job to keep the trails leading to the cabin in good shape all the time. These weren't the main trails. They were the little detours that Jonas told travelers were safer or faster ways to get there. He cut off fallen branches from these other paths, marked trees with small notches that acted as guides, and even planted wildflowers in key spots to make the detours look more inviting. It was gardening with a bad goal, landscaping that was meant to lead people to a certain place. Silas had set up a number of traps around the property over the years. They weren't traps in the traditional sense of the word. They were clever warning systems. Dry branches placed in the right places that broke under weight, stones stacked in a way that made them fall apart when touched, and thin ropes tied to tiny bells hidden away. This invisible barrier kept people from getting close to the cabin without the brothers knowing about it first, giving them time to get ready. The fireplace in the cabin's common room was the most important part of his hospitality. Jonas always kept dry firewood next to it so he could start a warm fire in no time. The smell of burning wood had a strong psychological effect, making even strangers feel safe and at home. He made strong dark coffee in a blackened iron coffee pot and served it in pewter mugs that warmed the travelers' hands. Every act of kindness was meant to lower defenses. We need to realize that the Appalachian Mountains were not only a physical barrier, but also a cultural and time barrier. People in those mountains who lived alone made up their own traditions, beliefs, and ways of punishing wrongdoers. Legends about creatures that weren't quite human, stories of travelers who went into the mountains and never came back, and stories of shadowy figures living in the woods were passed down from generation to generation. These stories, which were very real and very human, made the perfect cover for them. The brothers worked hard to keep up the appearance of being normal. They sometimes went to events in nearby villages, bought things they needed at local stores, and said hello to their neighbors who lived far away. Jonas even went to church on Sundays at a small wooden church in a nearby valley. He would sit quietly in the back and leave before the socializing started. They took great care to keep up this facade of normal, hard-working people. Silas was very good at using tools and building things. He had made the cellar under the cabin bigger by digging deeper into the hard ground, adding thick planks to the walls to make them stronger, and putting in a basic ventilation system that kept too much moisture from building up. The only way to get in was through the trapdoor in the common room, and he had put in a lock that only worked from the top. It was cleverness used for things that are hard to understand morally. The brothers' activities were based on the seasons. In the harsh winter months, when the trails were covered in deep snow and made it impossible to get around, they lived in almost complete isolation, focusing on maintenance and planning tasks. During this time, Jonas went over his notebooks again. Silas reorganized his strange collection, and they both talked about how to make the property better and how to improve their methods. Winter was a time to think about things and get ready for the busier times. The area changed a little bit in the spring of 1900. The thaw turned calm streams into raging torrents that rushed down the slopes with great force, carrying fallen trees and loose rocks. The main trails got muddy and dangerous, so people had to find other ways to get where they were going. In these situations, Jonas became more active, putting himself at crossroads and giving directions that always led to the cabin in the woods. The brothers had come up with certain signals that worked even when they were far apart. A small mirror that reflected sunlight in a certain way meant that someone was coming. The smoke from the chimney formed certain shapes that told people how many people were involved and whether they seemed to be a threat. Even the way tools were left in the outer yard sent coded messages. It was a way for people to talk to each other that no one else could see. Silas had a small garden behind the cabin where he grew simple vegetables like potatoes, carrots, and herbs. This garden served many purposes. It grew real food, helped people see settlers as honest and hard-working, and filled a space that needed to look normal and well-kept. He worked on that piece of land with care and attention, pulling weeds, watering it when it was dry, and keeping animals away from the plants with simple fences made of branches that he wove together. Jonas gathered stories. He not only wrote them down in his notebooks, but he also memorized them with amazing detail. He could tell stories he had heard months before, using regional accents, mimicking typical gestures, and recreating certain feelings. This skill made him a great storyteller around the fireplace at night. He used these stories to keep people entertained and distracted, to create a false sense of friendship, and to pass the time while Silas finished getting ready in the back of the house. The mountains had secrets hidden in their layers of sedimentary rock and deep valleys. There were natural caves all over the area. Some were explored by miners looking for coal or precious metals, while others were only known to those who took the time to map the area. Silas knew of at least 5 of these rock formations that were close enough to walk to. He went to each one from time to make sure they were clear of debris and structurally sound. People who didn't know what the cabin was really for wouldn't have understood its strange architectural features. There were hooks in the ceiling beams that looked like they were meant to hang meat for smoking, but they were too strong for that. The wooden floor had planks that could be taken out to get to spaces under the building. These were small hiding spots where things could be quickly hidden if needed. The windows were placed so that people inside could see everything outside, but it was hard for people outside to see inside during the day. Jonas had come up with a specific way of talking to people that involved asking seemingly innocent but carefully chosen questions. He would ask about family members waiting at the end of the trip, planned itineraries, and people who knew the way. Each answer gave useful information, such as possible risks, how long it would take for someone to notice that they were missing, and how isolated the person really felt. He turned casual chats into ways to get information. The tools Silas kept in the secondary structure were different and very specific. There were saws of different sizes, axes with handles worn down from use, and shovels with sharp blades that stayed rust-free because they were cleaned regularly. There was a specific place for each tool, either hanging from hooks or resting on wooden stands. He took care of them almost like they were sacred. He sharpened their blades often, oiled their moving parts, and replaced their handles when they started to break. It was practical upkeep that had bad effects. The land around the property, made areas where sound couldn't be heard. Sounds bounced off rock formations in strange ways. There was always white noise from the waterfalls that covered up other sounds. The thick vegetation soaked up sound waves like a giant sponge. The brothers had done a lot of testing on these properties, yelling from different places, banging metal against metal, and even firing old guns to find out exactly how far sounds traveled and where they naturally stopped. We can talk to each other right away and keep an eye on each other all the time now, but those mountains were the opposite in 1900. Someone could be only a few kilometers away from someone else and still be completely alone, with no way to call for help, no way to let the police know, and no hope of a quick rescue. This combination of geography and technology made people very vulnerable, and those with certain tendencies could take advantage of them in a planned way. Jonas had a small library of leather-bound books in his cabin that he had collected over the years. They had books on human anatomy, ironically preserved first aid manuals, and even some works of philosophy and classical literature. He really read these books during the long winter nights, not just to look smart, but because he was really interested in them. This duality between being cultured and having dark tendencies made his personality even more disturbing and complicated. In the summer, the Appalachian Mountains felt heavy on everything. The humid heat made the air feel thick and hard to breathe, like it was something you could touch. At dusk, clouds of mosquitoes and other bugs made living curtains, and the heat inside the cabin made it hard to do anything physical. But it was during these months that more and more people started to travel. They used the easy trails to cross the mountains before winter made them impossible to cross again. Over the years, Jonas had worked on his public image. He acted like he was a seasoned mountain guide who knew every landmark, danger, and strange thing about the rough terrain. He talked about black bears that sometimes came down from the highest peaks to look for food, poisonous snakes that lay on rocks in the sun, and storms that could turn calm streams into deadly torrents. Each warning made the outside world seem more dangerous, while the cabin was shown as a safe place to escape these threats. Silas worked on his practical skills all the time. He had learned how to work with leather with great skill, making bags, belts, and other things that he planned to sell in nearby villages. This legal activity gave a good reason for the presence of some specialized tools in his workshop, stains on his work clothes, and a certain smell that might come from secondary structures. Layers of normalcy hid darker truths in every part of their lives. County records say that the brothers' property officially covered a small area, but they actually controlled a much larger area. They didn't own it legally, but they knew it well and were always there. They knew of old cabins where the people who lived there had left decades ago, abandoned farms scattered across the hillsides, and structures that were slowly falling apart as the forest reclaimed them. On their mental map of the area, each of these places was a reference point and a possible resource for different things. Jonas had a friendly but distant relationship with the few neighbors who lived miles away. He sometimes traded goods with them, helped them during harvests or fence repairs, and only took part in the little community life that was going on in that area. This shallow integration was enough to keep people from being suspicious without making real connections that could lead to surprise visits or unwanted attention to his secluded property. The seasons made the area around the cabin look very different. In the fall of 1901, the leaves on the deciduous trees turned bright red, orange, and yellow before falling and making a thick carpet on the forest floor that made sounds even quieter. The days got shorter quickly, and the light coming through the branches made shadows that made the forest even more mysterious. It was the last time to harvest before winter, and people who were traveling rushed to finish their trips before the first snow. Silas had made a clever system for collecting rainwater that filled a tank that was hidden behind the main cabin. This reservoir, which was dug into the ground and lined with carefully placed stones, made sure there was always a clean water, even when it was dry. His practical creativity was amazing. He turned basic survival problems into efficient systems that needed little upkeep. He used this same method for everything he did in the mountains. Jonas's library kept getting bigger because books would show up in his collection without any clear explanation of where they came from. There were books about geology and rock formations, guides to the area's medicinal and poisonous plants, and even essays on how to preserve food and hunt. He really wanted to learn this stuff, so he made notes in the margins, underlined certain parts, and made his own indexes on blank pages at the end of each volume. The brothers made a nightly ritual that they always followed. They would sit on the narrow porch of the cabin in worn rocking chairs after a simple dinner of game meat and vegetables from the garden. Jonas would smoke his pipe while Silas worked on small leather projects or cleaned tools. They didn't talk much during these times. They mostly communicated through shared silences and quick looks at each other. It was during these times that the true nature of their partnership became most clear. There were a lot of animals in the forest around it. Deer walked through the clearings at dawn and dusk, leaving clear marks on the soft ground with their delicate hooves. Coyotes howled at night when the full moon was out, and their calls echoed through the valleys in a way that seemed almost magical. Owls hunted quietly in the trees, their ghostly shapes moving through the dark. The brothers had learned to tell the difference between sounds that were natural to the forest and sounds that didn't belong there. This made them very sensitive to sounds and made them aware of people right away. People who live in cities or suburbs can hardly imagine how quiet it can be in places that are really far away. There is no silence. Instead, there are natural sounds that are so constant that they become a kind of silence on their own. For example, the wind whispering through the leaves, the distant murmur of running water, and the occasional crack of a branch broken by a passing animal. In this situation, any human sound is very clear, so anyone who knows how to listen can't get close without being heard. Jonas wrote to a merchant who came to the area twice a year to bring supplies that couldn't be made there and take goods to sell in faraway markets. These letters were well written and only talked about boring business things like asking for certain books or tools. He kept in touch with the outside world through these few letters, but he never revealed anything important about what he was really doing. Silas had dug a number of shallow holes all over the property, each one covered with boards and hidden by plants. Officially, they were for keeping tubers safe from freezing during the winter while still being easy to get to. In real life, they were used as temporary hiding spots for different things. places where things could be quickly hidden if someone unexpected came by. There were no outside signs showing where each hiding place was. He only knew where they were in his head. The winter of 1902 was especially harsh, with blizzards that turned the Appalachian Mountains into a completely white landscape. The snow built up in thick layers, reaching waist-high in open areas. The icy winds that blew down from the peaks made frozen crystals swirl around that made it hard to see just a few meters away. During these terrible months, the brothers' cabin was completely cut off from the rest of the world. Only people who knew the secret paths through the thick trees that offered some protection from the weather could get there. Jonas took advantage of this time of forced solitude to study more. He had developed an unusual interest in moral philosophy, reading old books about the nature of good and evil, free will and determinism, and how people can use rational frameworks to explain their actions. His notes in the margins of these books showed that he was having trouble with basic contradictions and was trying to make sense of his own feelings and the moral frameworks he had read about. It was a disturbing mental exercise to use critical thinking on problems that he himself represented. During the winter, Silas worked on more and more complex carpentry projects. He put cabinets into the walls of the cabin, and they had secret compartments that could only be opened by hidden mechanisms. He made furniture with double drawers, and the false bottom showed extra space that most people wouldn't notice. Each piece showed off great technical skill and an obsessive focus on the smallest details. He worked by the light of oil lamps, and as he sawed, sanded, and fit pieces of wood together with almost artistic precision, his shadow danced on the log walls. In the winter, the property looked like a dark fairy tale. There were crystalline stalactites hanging from the roof eaves that bent the weak sunlight into pale rainbows. The bare trees' dark trunks stood out sharply against the white sky, and their skeletal branches reached up to the gray sky. There was a steady stream of smoke coming from the cabin's chimney, which was a vertical column that slowly disappeared into the cold air. It was a scene of stark beauty that hid less poetic truths beneath its frozen surface. The brothers kept a lot of supplies on hand to get through the harsh winters. There were hooks in the ceiling of the smokehouse where smoked meat hung. In the summer, it was wrapped in cloths to keep bugs away, but now the cold air has frozen it. The cold pantry next to the main building was full of bags of flour and grain. Jonas had made the brine for the jars of pickled vegetables according to recipes he had learned from memories of life before the mountains. The jars were lined up perfectly. Jonas had gotten into the habit of reading aloud at night during the winter. His deep voice broke the heavy silence of the cabin. He chose a wide range of texts, from classical poetry to stories about exploring new places, from scientific papers to Gothic fiction, which was popular at the time. While working on his projects, Silas listened and sometimes said something about something that caught his attention. These times made it seem like everything was normal at home, which was very different from other parts of their lives. The forest turned into a very quiet place in the winter. The snow made everything quiet, and the air was so icy and crystal clear that even whispers seemed to travel very far. Animals either hibernated or moved to lower altitudes, leaving only occasional tracks in the fresh snow to show that there was life beyond their siblings. White owls sometimes flew over, like silent ghosts against the pale sky, looking for small rodents that came above the snow to look for seeds that had been lost. Silas had set up a network of bells around the outside of the property that were connected by thin wires. In the summer, these wires were hidden in the thick plants, but in the winter, they were hidden under the snow. If anything happened along these lines, the bells inside the cabin would ring softly to let the brothers know that someone was nearby. During the worst months, it was unlikely that anyone would try to cross that land, but Silas's methodical paranoia made sure he was always careful, even when things seemed impossible. Jonas had a personal diary that was different from his travelogues. He wrote down his philosophical thoughts, dreams that scared him and woke him up in the middle of the night, and thoughts on the nature of memory and consciousness in this diary. His writing during these times was almost poetic, dealing with topics like being alone, finding oneself, and the thin line between civilization and savagery. He kept this diary in a hidden compartment under a loose floorboard in his room, which Silas didn't even know about. In the winter, the cabin smelled different than it did in the summer. It smelled like wood smoke, tanned leather, lamp oil, and something else that came from the old building itself. The log walls sometimes groaned under the weight of the snow on the roof. The brothers got so used to these sounds that they stopped paying attention to them. The heat from the fireplace made a big difference in temperature. It was warm near the fire but icy in the corners, where ice made fractal patterns on the small windows. People who live in modern times, with central heating and electricity, can hardly imagine what it would be like to spend months in almost complete isolation, relying only on what they had planned ahead of time and what they had saved up. There was no way to just go to the store if something ran out. If something went wrong, there was no way to get help. Every day was a test of both practical and mental strength, as they had to be completely self-sufficient. For most people, being alone like that would be very hard on their minds. For Silas and Jonas, it was the best situation. Jonas had started writing what he called a treatise on human nature, a growing book that looked into his ideas about morality, behavior, and the limits of empathy. He said that social norms were made up by people and forced on more basic impulses, and that civilization was just a thin layer over instincts that were still very savage. His ideas were expressed in a way that was disturbing clear, showing that he was very smart and could think about basic issues in a way that most people would instinctively reject. Silas made a small temporary observatory in a clearing near his cabin. It was a simple structure with a roof that could be taken off to see the night sky clearly. He had become very interested in astronomy, studying star patterns, following the movement of visible planets, and trying to understand how big the universe is. This thought about the infinite was a strange contrast to the limited and earthly things he did. He spent clear winter nights in that cold place, looking up at the sky while his breath made clouds of vapor that quickly disappeared in the cold air. In the spring of 1903, the mountains changed a lot. The thaw started slowly, with constant drips during the day that froze again at night. This made ice waterfalls that hung from the rocky cliffs like see-through curtains. As the temperature slowly rose, the compressed snow showed layers that had built up over months, each one marking a different storm or blizzard. As life returned to the forest, the world changed from a uniform white to a riot of colors. Jonas looked at these changes with new interest. He knew that the thaw would make the trails passable again soon, and that travelers would start crossing the mountains to enjoy the milder weather before the summer heat set in. He made sure his clothes were clean and neat, practiced making faces in front of a small cracked mirror, and went over how to greet people and start a conversation. It was a planned way to get ready to go back to the performance he had perfected over the years. Silas worked hard to keep the structures that had stood up to the harsh winter. He put in new boards where the old ones were rotting from the thaw's moisture, strengthened places where the weight of the snow had stressed support beams, and cleaned up the temporary gutters that directed rainwater away from the foundations. Each repair was done with care and attention to detail, making sure that everything was working perfectly before the busy season really started. The soil was still cold, but wildflowers were starting to grow through it. They were bright spots of color against the brown and green of the landscape that was starting to change. The clearings were full of purple violets, white daisies, and yellow dandelions, as if the ground itself were celebrating the end of winter. Jonas would sometimes pick some of these flowers and put them in a makeshift vase on the cabin window. It was a surprisingly kind thing to do, given how complicated he was. The birds came back in loud groups, singing and calling out in the forest, which had been quiet during the cold months. Goldfinches, bluebirds, blackbirds, and many other kinds of birds made nests in the branches that would soon be covered in new leaves. Dawn brought a loud symphony of sounds that started even before the sun rose. This woke the siblings up naturally, without the need for alarm clocks. Jonas added to his herb garden that spring by planting different kinds of herbs that he had ordered through his business contact in the winter. He grew thyme, sage, rosemary, and other medicinal plants that he learned about in his botany books. Some of these plants were clearly useful in the kitchen, while others had more mysterious qualities that piqued his interest. He kept a detailed notebook for each species, writing down things like how fast they grow, what conditions are best for them, how to harvest them, and how to store them. That spring, Silas built a small stable that was supposed to hold a horse or mule they were going to buy. The building was strong, with tightly fitted planks for walls and a roof that sloped down to keep snow from piling up. The inside had some interesting divisions, like compartments that seemed too big for just housing animals. He worked on this project by himself for weeks, turning down Jonas's offers of help from time to time, and keeping full control over every part of the building. There were a lot of animals in the forest in the spring. Deer carefully led their newborn fawns along the trails, their legs still shaking and unstable. Bears woke up from their long sleep thin and hungry, looking for roots, bugs, and anything else they could eat. The brothers sometimes saw new bear tracks near their house, which reminded them that they shared the area with dangerous animals. Jonas got a letter from a business partner saying that a new road was going to be built through the mountains, and it would be fairly close to the brothers' property. People were interested in this news, but they were careful about it. He quickly started to think about how to strategically place himself along this new trail so that he could become a local source of directions and help. He started to mentally plan out the chances that would come up if more people traveled. Silas spent a few days going over the route described in the letter, remembering every turn, fork, and natural landmark that could help him find his way. He found places where small hidden signs could be put up to point people in the right direction toward the cabin. These signs wouldn't be obvious or formal. Instead, they would be subtle carvings in trees, strange piles of stones, or branches broken in a certain way that would only look like they were part of the natural landscape to people who didn't know what they were for. The relationship between the brothers changed all the time. Even after all these years, they found a way to talk to each other without words, using small gestures, quick glances, and changes in body language that were almost too small to notice. This synchronicity made it possible for everyone to work together perfectly without having to talk about it. It was like they were all part of one mind that was split between two bodies, and each body naturally complemented what the other was doing. We can now see these mountains through the lens of history, knowing that they have seen many lives lived in isolation, and many stories that were never written down. The Appalachian Mountains have always been, and still are, a mysterious place where the vastness of nature can be both freeing and dangerous, beautiful and threatening. These mountains were more than just home for Silas and Jonas. They were also silent partners, giving them a place to live without a lot of outside interference. The summer of 1904 was a big turning point in how the brothers worked together. Jonas had learned that his reputation as a trustworthy guide was spreading from one traveler to another, and from one merchant to another, in the small communities around the mountains. People in far-off taverns and village warehouses talked about him. They always said he knew a lot about the area, and was always willing to help strangers. This fame that was growing was both useful and dangerous, so it had to be handled with great care. Silas stepped up his safety measures in response to this new level of visibility. He made the warning system around the property bigger by adding more and more complex parts that let him know when someone was coming, where they were coming from, and how many people were involved. Some of these devices were just mechanical and used weights and counterweights that were activated by pressure or movement. Some were surprisingly advanced, using glass pieces placed in certain ways to reflect sunlight in ways that made patterns that could only be seen from inside the cabin. That summer, the forest seemed thicker than ever. There had been a lot of rain in the spring, which made the plants grow very well. In some places, ferns grew to waist height, and their delicate fronds made green walls that blocked the view just a few steps away. Thick vines, as thick as human arms, wrapped around the trunks of old trees and spiraled up until they reached the high canopy, where sunlight filtered through and made patterns of light and shadow that changed. Jonas started writing down not only facts about the people he met, but also bigger trends he saw. He tracked changes in the flow of travelers over the seasons, found routes that became popular and then fell out of favor, and kept track of the reasons people crossed the mountains. He turned this collection of data into an almost scientific understanding of how people moved through that area. He organized this information into tables and graphs that he drew by hand with great care. That summer, Silas became interested in geology in a way that surprised him. He spent hours looking at rock formations, collecting samples of different minerals, and studying layers of sediment that were visible in cliffs and ravines. Stones quickly filled his room, sorted by type, color, and where they were thought to have come from. He made a mental three-dimensional map of the underground structure of the mountains around him by writing down the exact places where each sample had been found. This obsession had clear practical benefits, like finding natural caves and useful formations. But it also seemed to satisfy a real intellectual curiosity about how that world had formed over millions of years. In the summer, the cabin was very busy, which was very different from how quiet it was in the winter. Jonas had more and more visitors, but he always acted like a lonely, welcoming host who liked having people over but mostly wanted to be alone. He made simple but filling meals, like strong, dark coffee and bread that he baked himself in a brick oven next to the cabin. Every act of hospitality was carefully planned to make a certain impression, balancing friendliness with keeping certain limits that should not be crossed. During these first few meetings, Silas didn't show up very often. He stayed in secondary structures or the forest, doing things that seemed like they were important but mostly kept him out of sight while Jonas looked at people and situations. Over the years, this division of labor had become an unspoken but strictly followed set of rules. Jonas was the public face, the first person to talk to people, and the first person to judge. Silas was the shadow, the quiet boss, and the person most visitors never really got to know. There were both problems and chances that came with summer nights. When the sun went down behind the distant peaks, the heat stayed in the cabin, making it stuffy and uncomfortable. Jonas often told guests to sleep outside, under the stars, where the occasional breeze made it a little more comfortable. He would set up a makeshift campsite in a certain clearing, bring blankets, and start a small fire to keep wild animals away. It was a deal that made sense given the weather, but it also had strategic goals that only the brothers knew about. That year, Jonas got a lot more books. His business contacts sent him whole crates of them. He had asked for specific books on human psychology, a new field that was starting to put together observations about behavior and motivation. He was fascinated by these academic books because they gave him words and ways of thinking about parts of human nature that he had seen but never been able to explain in a systematic way. He read by lamplight all night and took detailed notes that connected abstract ideas to his real-life experiences. Silas made a number of increasingly complex hiding places all over the property and in the nearby woods. Some were just holes covered in plants, while others were more complicated, like small underground rooms that could only be reached through hidden doors. In a system that only he fully understood, each hideout had a specific purpose. Some had tools, Others had emergency supplies, and some had items from his strange collection that he moved around from time to time. It was a network of resources spread out over a wide area that showed paranoid but very well-organized planning. The brothers' relationships with the people in the area were still carefully watched over. Jonas sometimes went to small social events, like cattle auctions, seasonal markets, and even the funerals of people they only knew a little bit. These appearances were planned. They happened often enough to keep people aware of them, but not so often that people expected them to be more involved. He always came by himself, saying that Silas was busy with important work on the property. Silas was very good at using animal traps, but not the ones with metal jaws that hurt the animals right away. He used more advanced traps that caught animals without hurting them right away. He had looked at designs in old books, tried out his own, and tried out different setups in the forest's more remote areas. These traps were supposed to catch wild animals for food or keep deer from eating the garden. In practice, they showed a deep understanding of mechanics, applied physics, and animal behavior that went beyond simple explanations. Jonas kept in touch with a few people he had met over the years, including travelers who had stayed in the cabin and then gone on to have safe journeys. These letters were carefully written, friendly, but not too personal. They had the tone of friendly acquaintances who shared good memories but didn't have a reason to talk to each other often. He kept copies of each letter he sent in a worn leather folder, arranged them in chronological order, and made a record of his public persona that he could look back on if he needed to make sure he was consistent in future interactions. The brothers got to know the area around the property better and better as they explored it more and more. They knew caves that few other people had been to, rock formations that were so far away that they probably didn't have official names, and hidden valleys where the forest grew in strange ways because of certain microclimates. This knowledge of the land was not only useful, but it also gave them a strange sense of pride, a feeling of power over power that went beyond formal legal ownership. We attempt to comprehend individuals such as Silas and Jonas through contemporary frameworks of psychology and criminology. However, it may be inherently challenging to fully grasp minds that function with fundamentally divergent logic. They weren't impulsive or out of control. In fact, they showed amazing planning and self-control. They weren't stupid or uneducated. In fact, they were surprisingly cultured and curious about things. These traits made them especially mysterious and in some ways more disturbing than people who only act out of anger or need. In the fall of 1905, the brothers' relationship changed in small but important ways. Jonas had started to notice signs that being in the same places all the time was making things too familiar. People who walked by often were starting to ask him more specific questions about his life, Silas, and how they kept their property private. People asked these questions out of real and friendly curiosity, and there was no sign of malice. However, this kind of attention needed to be stopped before it became a problem. Silas told them that they should become even more reclusive for an unknown amount of time, so that people's memories of them would naturally fade. Jonas agreed with some of what he said, but he said that being completely absent could lead to just as much speculation as being too present. They came to an agreement that Jonas would still show up from time to time, but only in different communities. This way, no one group of people would see him often enough to become very curious about the details of his life. That fall, the forest changed into very bright red and orange colors that were very striking. The trees that lose their leaves turned into natural torches of color against the evergreens. The wind blew through the valleys, and colorful leaves fell from the branches in waves that danced in the air before landing softly on the ground. The effect was a kind of natural show that was so beautiful that it could make even the most troubled minds stop and appreciate it for a moment. That fall, Jonas went back through all of his notebooks and read again years' worth of notes about people, patterns, and events. He started to see connections that he hadn't noticed before when things were happening right away. There were certain types of people who came and went in predictable cycles, and certain routes that became popular and then fell out of favor, which he could now see coming. This retrospective analysis turned raw data into strategic insights that he started using in the future, making his operations even more planned and efficient. During that time, Silas worked hard to make what he called a complete archive of the property. He made detailed maps that showed every building, trail, hiding place, and important natural feature. He drew these maps with obsessive accuracy on big sheets of paper that he had bound together into a thick book. Each map had notes on what each place was for, how to get to hidden areas, and even plans for how to deal with different situations that might come up that would need quick action. As autumn turned into winter, the nights got longer, and the brothers changed their plans to fit. They got up later and used the dark to do things they didn't want to be seen doing. Jonas wrote his philosophical manuscript by lamplight, adding to his arguments and improving his language. He would sometimes read parts of it aloud to Silas, who would give short but helpful comments. These nightly meetings made the cabin feel like a classroom, where people could talk about controversial ideas without worrying about what other people thought. That fall, Silas started playing around with photography after getting an old camera from Jonas's business contact. It was still pretty new and not very common in faraway places like those mountains. He turned a small area in the basement into an improvised darkroom, where he developed photographic plates using chemicals he made from recipes he found in a technical manual. His first tries made blurry, overexposed pictures, but he kept going with his usual determination until he learned how to do it. The things Silas chose to photograph were strange and telling. He took pictures of the forest at different times of the year and at different times of the day, showing how light and shadow changed the same places. He took pictures of buildings on the property from certain angles that brought out their architectural details. He made a series of self-portraits and portraits of Jonas that showed the brothers in stiff, formal poses that were common in photography at the time. Their expressionless faces stared straight at the camera with a disturbing intensity. Jonas became interested in astronomy like Silas did, but while Silas was more interested in just looking at things, Jonas was more interested in the philosophical and existential parts of thinking about the universe. He wrote long essays about how small people are compared to the size of the universe, and how geological and astronomical time made individual lives basically unimportant. He used these nihilistic writings to back up some moral and ethical conclusions that most people would find very troubling. That fall, the brothers' land had become almost self-sufficient for basic needs. The bigger garden grew enough vegetables to last them for months, and they had extra that they could save for the winter. There were a lot of animals in the area, like deer, wild turkeys, and small mammals, that provided regular protein. They had put up beehives, which made honey that was both a sweetener and a preservative. This ability to take care of themselves made them less dependent on other communities, which made them even more isolated. Silas made a complicated system for collecting and filtering rainwater that fed not only the main reservoir, but also smaller tanks all over the property. Some tanks were for drinking water, some were for irrigation, and some were for processes that needed very clean water. He designed the sand filters based on what he read in civil engineering books. The system also had layers of activated carbon that cleaned the water and even simple aeration systems that made the water taste better. It had infrastructure that was as good as what you would find in small towns at the time. Jonas had a habit of writing letters that he never sent. This was a literary exercise for him to explore thoughts he couldn't share in real letters. He wrote these fake letters to famous people from history, authors whose books he had read, and even made up versions of himself in different situations. He kept these letters in a different box, organized by date, which made a separate record of his inner life that was completely separate from his interactions with the outside world. That fall, the forest seemed especially alive at night. Owls hooted to each other in the dark, and their calls echoed through the trees in a way that seemed almost magical. Coyotes sometimes came close to the property, and their distant howls made a wild chorus that rose and fell in complicated patterns. It seemed like the night winds carried voices, whispers that weren't really words, but made it seem like some kind of basic, unexplainable communication was going on. Every night before bed, Silas would walk around the edge of the property, checking every point on his alert system and looking for anything strange in the forest around him. These walks at night turned into almost meditative times when he could be alone with his thoughts without Jonas being there. He had a closed lantern that gave off very little light. It was just enough to keep him from tripping, but not so bright that it messed up his night vision. He moved through the shadows like a ghost, with no sound. Jonas started to doubt some of the decisions they had made over the years, not because they were wrong, but because they were not smart. He thought about whether they had been too careful in some ways and too reckless in others. These thoughts weren't really regret in the usual sense. They were more like a cold look at how well things worked and how well they worked. He talked about these things with Silas late at night. The two brothers debated like academics, looking at an abstract problem without getting too emotional about the real-life situations their words represented. Over the years, the brothers' relationship had grown into something that went beyond the usual definitions of family or partnership. They worked together as one being with two bodies, each with skills and points of view that were perfect for the other. They worked out their differences through a process that was part rational debate and part shared intuition. There was no clear order among them. They were neither leaders nor followers. They were co-creators of a life they had built together. Silas wrote in his own diary, which was like Jonas's notebooks but with a different focus. Jonas wrote down his thoughts on people and social patterns, while Silas wrote down technical details, exact measurements and tests he did with different materials and methods. His diary was almost like an engineering manual or a scientific lab notebook, with lots of diagrams, calculations, and notes on what worked and what didn't. It was a look into a mind that mostly saw the world through the lens of how things worked and how they could be fixed. That fall, the Appalachian Mountains looked like they were getting ready for a very cold winter. Animals were quickly building up fat stores, making shelters that were more complex than usual, and acting in ways that locals recognized as signs of bad weather on the way. The brothers saw these signs in nature and took their own steps to protect themselves, such as gathering extra firewood, strengthening buildings, and getting ready for the possibility of being completely cut off for months. We can see these mountains now and know that they hold many secrets and stories that will never be fully known or understood. People have lived in the Appalachian Mountains for many generations. Some lived in peace with the natural world around them, while others were always at war with it. Silas and Jonas were in a different group. They weren't in harmony or conflict. Instead, they used every feature of the environment to their advantage, turning geography and isolation into resources that only they fully understood how to use. The natural signs had promised that winter would come with a lot of force, and it did. In early December of that year, the snow started to fall. It was thick, heavy flakes that quickly piled up, turning the world into a white, silent place. The brothers watched through the cabin's small windows as the white blanket slowly covered the trees in the forest around them, making them look like dark shapes against the low, gray sky. That winter, Jonas spent a lot of time thinking deeply about all the things he had done over the years. He would sit for hours in front of the fireplace, watching the flames dance while his mind drifted through memories and thoughts. This self-reflection had a sad quality to it, as if he were trying to figure out what they had built in that lonely place and why they had chosen to live in the remote mountains. Silas stuck to his usual routines with the same discipline, but even he seemed to be affected by the quiet mood of that winter. His nightly walks around the outside of the cabin got longer, and he would be gone for hours in the dark while Jonas stayed inside the warm cabin. When he came back, he had a cold air about him and a distant look on his face, as if he were thinking about things he couldn't or didn't want to say. That winter, the mountains looked like they had been there forever, as if they were outside of the normal flow of days and weeks. The thick clouds kept the sun from shining through, making it always look like twilight. This made it hard to tell the difference between morning and afternoon. The snow kept falling at random times, piling on top of what was already there. There was complete silence except for the sound of branches breaking under the weight of the snow. During those weeks of being completely alone, Jonas started writing something else. It wasn't an extension of his philosophical essay or notes from his observation notebooks. Instead, it was a story that seemed to mix autobiographical and speculative fiction elements. He wrote about two brothers who lived in the mountains, but he changed their real lives into something more mythical and symbolic, as if he were trying to find deeper meaning in the patterns of their lives. Silas worked hard to make small sculptures out of wood by using sharp knives to turn pieces of fallen branches into abstract shapes. He had never been interested in art before, but now he spent hours working on these pieces, his hands moving with precision as they revealed hidden shapes in the wood. The sculptures that came out of it were unsettlingly beautiful, like they were frozen in time and had energy trapped in solid form. The two brothers talked less that winter than they ever had before. There was no tension between them. Instead, they both felt that something was changing, but they couldn't put it into words. They were both in the same physical space, but they were lost in their own worlds, each processing decades of shared experiences from their own unique points of view. The forest around me seemed to be waiting for something. Trees covered in snow, like quiet guards, watching over secrets hidden in the frozen ground. The nights were long and dark, and the only light came from the full moon reflecting off the snow, which made the shadows look like ghosts and made them look like they were moving. It was like something out of a dark fairy tale, both beautiful and scary at the same time. Jonas finally gave up on his unfinished story, leaving pages all over a rustic table without trying to put them in order or finish the story. Silas stopped making his sculptures and left some of them on shelves, where they collected a thin layer of dust. It seemed like both of them had come to some sort of silent agreement, that some questions didn't have good answers, and that some patterns were just what they were, with no deeper meaning. When spring finally came, the forest started to thaw, and life returned to it. The brothers came out of their winter isolation changed in small but noticeable ways. Their movements were quieter, and their words were more thoughtful. They kept up with their usual tasks, took care of the property, and got ready for the annual influx of travelers who would soon be back on the trails. But something deep down had changed, as if the winter of thinking had changed something important about how they lived in that remote area. The Appalachian Mountains went on living as they always had, not caring about the little dramas that played out in their valleys and peaks. They had seen many generations of life come and go, each leaving a small mark on their vast geological landscape. Silas and Jonas were just two of the thousands of people who had gone to those faraway places looking for something, whether it was safety, freedom, or something darker that can't be easily named. The story of the brothers would eventually fade away into the mists of memory. It might become a whispered legend in taverns, or it might just be forgotten as new events took over the attention of the communities that were spread out. The mountains would keep their secrets, as they always had. They were indifferent and eternal, slowly changing over geological eras while human dramas played out and then disappeared into their deep shadows.